Well, it's being called a roadmap to help hydroelectric companies, utilities, and other firms who depend on natural resources better manage and value the ecosystems they depend on. Earlier today, the World Resources Institute, along with World Business Council for Sustainable Development, held a briefing on what they're calling a new tool that companies can use to enhance their bottom lines. Clean Sky's Dan Goldstein was there. So Dan, this is more than just going green as sloganeering.
That's right, Susan. Basically what these folks are trying to do is they're trying to make this going green, as we look at it maybe on the retail side, is more strategic for companies, and it's not just a slogan. Here's a good example of what happens when you don't do it. In 2004, the British government denied Associated British Ports permission for a port expansion because they felt it would hurt ecosystems close by. Now, Associated British Ports had to write off £45 million. That's about $100 million worth of the project, and its share price dropped 12% in the week following the permit denial. So basically today's event was really sharing some of the best practices with business managers using what they called the Ecosystems Review, or ESR, which was jointly developed by WRI and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Now basically what this is, it's an Army field manual for companies for essentially doing the right thing when it comes to ecosystems in the field, valuing the ecosystems that they have under their control. Now, WRI says that companies have to do this more because the regulatory world is becoming more sophisticated, and they're beginning to penalize companies when they don't do the right thing.
Questions we often hear from companies is, to what degree do ecosystems and ecosystem services have an impact on the corporate bottom line? And there's no better example than an example from last year, August of 2008, when a federal judge levied a $102 million fine on Union Pacific for a forest fire that actually started on Union Pacific lands and spread to national federal U.S. forests. And the interesting thing of this case wasn't that there was a fine or it was the biggest fine ever for damage to federal forests. It was how the judge actually calculated the amount of damages. And the judge didn't just look at the amount of timber that had been lost in this forest, but also included the loss of soil, because the soil had been burned, wildlife, the views, the aesthetic views of the forest, the recreational value of the forest, and other ecosystem services that this forest provided. It was one of the first times we've ever seen where a judge actually based the amount of a fine on a broader ecosystem services valuation.
Now, one of those companies, too, that was at today's event was BC Hydro of British Columbia. They obviously develop hydroelectric power in the Northwest, and they have two very big concerns: water runoff and drought. And they also have another one which is particularly interesting. They have to manage, basically balance hydroelectric power with the spawning of salmon. And I talked with Scott Harrison, who's their environmental manager, on how exactly they do that. Here's what he had to say.
With the Ecosystem Services Review, we look at all the ecosystem services that are required for us to produce electricity, and as you pointed out, salmon use those rivers as well. And so for salmon, it's a matter of timing for water releases, because the salmon aren't in the river all the time. There are 5 species of salmon on the coast, so it gets very complicated very quickly, and that's why we, through the water use planning and through the Ecosystem Services Review, we get the community groups together to talk about how they want the water flows, for instance, to work.
Now, WRI also has some good examples of what some companies are doing right, and here's one you probably know about. Now, federal law requires that developers must, if they destroy wetlands, they have to purchase offsetting credits in what they call wetland mitigation banks. And one of those companies is Chevron Texaco, who did exactly that. In 2005, they converted a tapped-out drilling facility in Louisiana, a 2,800-hectare site, to generate those credits. Now, guess what? The expected market price of that area was about $8,000 to $10,000 per hectare, and so the company might get as much as $150 million just by doing that alone. Susan, so it's real interesting.
Wow, it sure is. All right, Dan Goldstein, thank you for that.